Today we have a PS5 Slim that has no video output. So if we take a look here at the HDMI port, we can see that it is not only damaged, but if we plug in a cable, it does not seem to probably even be attached on the inside. It's just kind of wobbling around here. So we are definitely going to need to replace that. In order to open it up, we're going to pull this tab right here, and then we're going to slide the panel over to the right hand side. And if you take a look on the inside here, there are some hooks. You'll see those go down and latch into the bottom. On the opposite side here, we're just going to pop this tab up over here and then lift it out from the bottom side. Now we have a sticker here we want to remove for the fan motor, and we're going to unplug the fan, and then we've also got a warranty sticker that needs to be removed. So what I like to do is start with the expansion slot. We'll take out this Phillips screw here and remove this panel. From here, we'll go ahead and just kind of unroute the fan cable from underneath this tab, and we're going to lift the connector straight up. You want to be careful with these. They are easy to damage if you're not careful. Now from here, we have a whole bunch of screws that we're going to remove. We'll start with the ones on the fan motor itself, and then we'll work our way around the perimeter of the case. By the way, you want to make sure to keep these screws organized. They are different sizes and different thread types as well. Also, you'll notice that after I removed the fan, there were a couple more screws that I needed to go back and remove. Somehow I skipped over them. So do make sure that you've got all the screws out before you try to pull the back panel off. So we've got one up here and then one over on the left-hand side that still need to come out. All right, now from here we can just lift the panel off from the back side. And make sure you don't lose the dust cover right here. That is for the expansion slot. We have two antenna wires that we're going to disconnect. Be careful when you pry these up. You want to make sure only to put pressure on the metal piece. Otherwise you can literally just pull the wire out from the connection. And once you have those disconnected, you can follow this fun little route of unwinding these. It's very interesting the way they put these in here, but they also go under one of these little foam rubbery things that are kind of a pain to work with. So I recommend you just try to pry underneath the glue for this thing as much as possible. You can add some rubbing alcohol, but in my experience, that can cause these things to kind of disintegrate a little bit. So there's just not really an easy way to get them off clean. All right, so we'll go ahead and unroute these antenna wires. Then we've got a whole bunch of screws that need to come out. There's one that you will see here, but you won't actually be able to reach down at the bottom right over here because it's kind of covered up. So we'll come back to that one later on. It's actually underneath the metal panel. Up here at the top right hand corner, you're going to have one screw that's longer than the rest. That's going to be the first one that I remove here. And it is the only one of its type. The rest of these are all very short and they are interchangeable. All right, once we've got all the screws out, we can go ahead and lift up on this metal panel and you will feel a bit of resistance, so do make sure you have all of the screws removed. But there's a thermal material underneath here that's going to make it feel like it's still stuck together with something, so you will have some resistance. And eventually it should pop off, and you can see these little round things here. That's what you're basically fighting against. This little deal over here is super flimsy, so be careful with that. There's not really much holding it together except for that strip of tape. We've got a wide connector up here that was surprisingly difficult to remove. Now you have to press down on this metal tab in order to release those two little blue windows you see on either edge. But I would just recommend that you take it very slowly and make sure that it's completely detached. This thing fits super snug. You see these little those little rectangular windows? That's the tab that we want to make sure not to damage pulling it out. And this one came out without any problems, but you will feel some resistance on it even when you release the gate. And I'm not sure why that is, other than that maybe this is just a very snug fit. But as you can see, those two pieces are still intact, and that's what I was concerned about as I was removing them. Alright, so there's a little padding right here, adhesive piece that I like to take off the HDMI port. We're going to put it onto the new one after it's installed, and I will usually stick it right here just so that I do not forget. We've got a couple screws that need to come out. These are not Phillips, they're actually Torx 8 now, so they have changed this design a little bit on the inside. But this is for your heatsink clamp. And basically the same as the small screws, except these are not security bits. And once we remove this clamp, we still have a couple screws that need to come out that are now accessible on the motherboard. And you'll see there's one here and one right over here. They both have a little triangle that points to them, so that will make it easy to remember where to put them back in during the installation. Alright, once we have those out, we are just about ready to remove the motherboard. You want to make sure that all of your cables are not in the way and blocking anything. Now when we go to remove this, you are going to feel a bit of resistance up here. That's where the power supply connects to the motherboard. So we're going to have to do a little prying in order to get it out. So I'll usually start at one side and just kind of work my way across. I did flip this around just to make it a little easier, because we want our pry tool to be able to go underneath the motherboard right where those two prongs are located. So if you just lift here on one side, you can kind of work your way across, and don't push your pry tool very far underneath the motherboard. There are components on the other side, but right here along the edge is pretty safe, and you just want to release this from the right hand bottom corner there, and once that pops out, this will be easy to remove. It is kind of wedged in there at the top, so make sure that you just kind of angle it outwards. And once we've got that out, you can see our thermal paste, or liquid metal rather, needs to be protected. So in order to prevent contamination of that area, we are going to cover that up. We'll set this aside for the moment. And then I like to use this little plastic piece just to cover the liquid metal that's still on the motherboard. So if you line these holes up just right, you can actually set this piece down right on top. You will want to add something to hold it in place though, because that on its own is not going to stay. I like to add a little painter's tape. You can use Kapton, whatever you've got, but do make sure you go over the metal center, because sometimes those pieces will pop out as well. Alright, on the back side here, we've got the same components that we had on the PS5. I went ahead and taped those off already so that they wouldn't fall out of position. We'll heat the motherboard from the bottom here, and we've got about the same amount of time required in order to liquefy this thing. I'm using a quick 861DW hot air station, no nozzle, full airflow, 120 liters per minute, and I'm at 420 degrees Celsius. And you'll see that it still takes roughly a minute for this to become warm enough to release the port from the motherboard. Alright, so you can see everything got liquefied there. We will go ahead and clean up these pads, and I'm going to say in this situation, at least in the future, I will add solder to these pads before I install the port. This time I took everything off, and I'll usually do it one of two ways, but for whatever reasons, maybe I need new tips on my iron, but I had a little trouble getting the solder to melt. And if you put solder underneath here before you begin the installation, that's okay, but you will have to push down and make sure that the port fits snugly, because you'll have that pressure from the materials that are on the pads itself pushing up against the port. This is one of the methods, basically my favorite method for removing the solder from the anchor holes. There are a number of different ways that you can do this, but I find just a piece of solder wick and a bit of heat from the bottom along with your iron will usually do the trick pretty well. And you can kind of see the moment where the solder sucks up into the wick. And that'll be your signal that the holes are pretty much clear. Alright, so after this cools down a bit, we'll go ahead and clean it up. And you'll see we do have that same 4K capacitor there, so you want to be careful of that. I did have to flip this around to try to get a better camera angle, and even then it's not as good as I would like it to be. I'm going to elevate the board on the right hand side here a little bit, but getting this thing on camera is a little tricky. Alright, so we'll put this down, and I do like to attach some of the connectors on this side just to hold the port in place, and then I'll flip it over, do the anchors, and then we'll come back and touch up anything that we haven't hit yet, especially that area where that capacitor is sitting. And one thing that happens when you're making a video showing micro soldering is that the gaps in time in between each segment will often allow the motherboard to cool down to the point where you're going to have a little trouble getting things to melt. So this is easiest to do as soon as you remove the port. Otherwise you'll probably have to add a little heat. Now if you happen to have a pair of micro tweezers, this is probably the best way to apply the solder here, because you'll hit 3 different pins at one time and you get very good heat transfer this way. But I understand not everyone has this option, so you can certainly do this with a regular soldering iron. The technique will just be a little different. And it looks like I'm running out of solder. Alright, we will come back to this once we get our anchors installed. And this is the piece of tape that I used to cover up that diode and capacitor, just to be absolutely certain they don't go flying off the board. I'm going to go ahead and preheat it now before we try to get the solder on here, because getting that to go all the way through, it can be a bit of a challenge even with leaded solder. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look on the other side. The anchors are looking pretty decent. I am actually going to have to touch one up a little bit later on, but we'll go ahead and finish off these connections. And like I said, the sooner you get in here, the better, because the board's still pretty warm from the heat I was using on the other side. But getting some of these ground pins can be a bit challenging, especially when you're really trying not to burn the plastic. And you definitely don't want to nudge that capacitor. It's just a lot of extra added work if you have to reattach it. And you can see that second pin from the top is just stubborn. Alright, I think we finally got it down. And there was a bridge over here I had to clear. Alright, and those are solid. And you can see this one particular post anchor didn't quite make it all the way through. So I will add some heat from this side and we'll flow that out until it's nice and even like the others. Alright, so that is looking better. And we can get this thing back together. Alright, let's get this plugged in, make sure the fan kicks on, and we will have our final test. And that will be to make sure we have an image on the screen.